As the autumn of 1939 descended upon Europe and the inevitability of a second global conflict became clear, the British Military High Command formally approved a new standard infantry weapon, the rifle No. 4, effectively the latest iteration of the Lee-Enfield. To the casual observer and military theorist alike, this decision appeared to be a significant strategic misstep, if not a technological regression. The Lee-Enfield design was not new. Its mechanical lineage could be traced directly back to the late 19th century, rooted in the Victorian era of warfare. While the British were doubling down on a manually operated boltication system, the rest of the world seemed to be moving in a different direction. Nazi Germany was fielding the Karabiner 98K, a refined Mauser design, while the United States was in the process of mass-producing the M1, a semi-automatic rifle that promised to revolutionize infantry firepower. In this context, Britain's decision to bet the fate of its infantry on a weapon that required manual cycling for every shot was viewed by modernizers as an embarrassment. They argued that the bolt-action rifle belonged in a museum, a relic of a bygone era, rather than on the modern battlefields of a mechanized war. However, history would soon prove these critics wrong, as the Lee-Enfield was about to demonstrate that mechanical specification sheets do not always translate directly to combat effectiveness. The criticism leveled against the British choice was not without merit, particularly when viewed through the lens of pure mechanical efficiency. By the 1930s, the consensus among forward-thinking military planners was that the future of infantry combat lay in semi-automatic fire. The mathematical advantage was undeniable. A soldier trained on the American M1 Grunt could theoretically deliver between 40 and 50 aimed rounds per minute downrange. The genius of the semi-automatic system was that the weapon itself performed the heavy lifting. The gas-operated mechanism cycled the action, ejected the spent casing, and chambered a fresh round almost instantaneously. The shooter's only responsibility was to manage the recoil, reacquire the sight picture, and pull the trigger. In stark contrast, the bolt-action rifle demanded a complex physical interaction for every single round fired. The soldier had to lift the bolt handle, pull it rearward to eject the empty case, push it forward to strip a new round from the magazine, and lock the handle down to seal the breech. These were 4 distinct, manual movements that ate into precious seconds' time that could otherwise be used for aiming or firing. On paper, it was not a fair contest. The semi-automatic rifle offered a volume of fire that a bolt action simply could not match mechanically. The British military establishment was not ignorant of these facts. Between 1930 and 1933, the Small Arms Committee had conducted rigorous and extensive trials to evaluate the feasibility of adopting a semi-automatic rifle. They tested various domestic and foreign designs, including the Vickers-Armstrong-Pedersen rifle and the Danish Bang system. However, the trials revealed significant flaws in the available technology. The Pedersen design required lubricated ammunition to function reliability, a requirement that was deemed a critical logistical vulnerability in the dirty, chaotic conditions of field warfare. The Bang system, while innovative, proved to be mechanically fragile and prone to failure under sustained usage. Beyond the technological hurdles, the decision to stick with the Lee-Enfield was driven by the cold, hard realities of logistics and economics. The British Empire was a global entity with a massive existing infrastructure built around the .303 caliber cartridge. Billions of rounds of ammunition were already stockpiled, and millions of older Lee-Enfields were in armories. Retooling the entire industrial base to produce a completely new weapon system and a new type of ammunition precisely when the nation needed to rearm as quickly as possible would have been a recipe for disaster. The risk of manufacturing disruption was too high. Consequently, Britain entered a modern mechanized war, equipped with what looked like yesterday's technology. When hostilities commenced in September 1939, the new number for rifles was scarce, existing mostly as trial models and tooling samples. The vast majority of British troops entering the conflict were still armed with the older short magazine Lee-Enfield No. 1 Mark III Star, the veteran rifle of the First World War. To meet the voracious demands of total war, the British government brought 3 new factories online in 1941, ROF Maltby in Yorkshire, ROF Fazakerley in Liverpool, and BSA Shirley in Birmingham. These factories would eventually churn out millions of rifles, with Maltby producing 737,000, Fazakerley contributing 619,000, and Shirley adding another 665,000. Interestingly, North American production capabilities proved vital and actually exceeded domestic British output. The Savage Stevens Company in Massachusetts produced roughly 1.2 million number for rifles under the Lend-Lease Agreement, stamping us property on weapons destined for British hands, while Canada's Long Branch arsenal added another 910,000 to the total. This massive industrial effort ensured that despite the initial shortage, the No. 4 would become the ubiquitous arm of the Commonwealth forces. What the critics and the spreadsheet theorists failed to understand, however, was that the Lee-Enfield was not just a generic bolt-action rifle. It was a unique beast, arguably the fastest cycling service bolt-action ever fielded. In the hands of a soldier properly trained in its manipulation, the Lee-Enfield could achieve rates of fire that approached semi-automatic standards, achieved not through complex gas systems but through mechanical elegance and human skill. The secret to this speed lay in the design of the bolt itself. Most contemporary military rifles, such as the German Kar 98K and the American Springfield M1903, utilized Mauser pattern actions. These actions featured forward-locking lugs, which necessitated a 90-degree rotation of the bolt handle to unlock the breech. This required the shooter to move their hand significantly up and over, disrupting their firing position. The Lee-Enfield, conversely, utilized rear-locking lugs. This design choice allowed for a much shorter bolt rotation, commonly sighted between 60 and 70 degrees. This seemingly minor difference fundamentally transformed the shooting experience. Instead of a large, clumsy arm movement, the Lee-Enfield operator performed a tight, rapid flick of the wrist. It was a fluid rhythm: tap, pull, push, close. The design allowed the shooter to keep their cheek welded to the stock. And there I focused on the sights while cycling the weapon, a feat that was difficult to replicate with Mauser-style actions without losing the target picture. Furthermore, the Lee-Enfield featured a cock-and-closing mechanism. This meant that the mechanical effort required to compress the striker spring was distributed between the opening and closing strokes of the bolt, rather than being concentrated entirely on the opening lift, as with many other designs. This distribution of force made the actions smoother and less fatiguing to operate over long periods of firing. This mechanical fluidity was paired with another decisive advantage: magazine capacity. While almost every other major military power fielded rifles with internal 5-round magazines, the Lee-Enfield was fed from a detachable box magazine holding 10 rounds of .303 British ammunition, although British doctrine generally dictated that the magazine be reloaded via 2 5-round charger clips through the open action rather than by swapping the magazine itself. The capacity advantage was undeniable. A British soldier had 10 rounds of rapid, aimed fire at his disposal before he was forced to pause and reload, double the capacity of his German counterpart. In the heat of a firefight, that difference could mean superiority. The British Army did not merely rely on the mechanical advantages of the rifle, they built an entire training doctrine around exploiting them. The standard of marksmanship within the British military was rigorous. The baseline requirement, known as the Mad Minute, demanded that a soldier place 15 aimed rounds into a target at 300 yards within 60 seconds. This was not a standard for elite troops. This was the passing grade for the annual musketry qualification. Soldiers who could not meet this rate of fire and accuracy failed. Well-trained troops, particularly the professional soldiers of the pre-war era, regularly exceeded this, achieving 20 to 30 aimed rounds per minute. The potential of this system was best exemplified by the legendary feat of Sergeant Major Jesse Wallingford, a firearms instructor, an Olympic competitor. Wallingford is recorded to have placed 36 hits on a 48-inch target at 300 yards in 1 minute during a demonstration in 1908. While Wallingford was an exceptional case, his performance demonstrated the extreme upper limits of what the Lee-Enfield platform could achieve in the hands of a master. The tactical validity of this emphasis on rapid, accurate rifle fire was proven in blood during the opening months of the First World War, a lesson that carried over into the Second. At the Battle of Mons in August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force faced the advancing German army. The Germans, relying on massed infantry formations, expected to overrun the smaller British force with ease. They were unprepared for the wall of lead they encountered. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers later recounted the engagement, describing how his unit lined the banks of a canal and opened fire on the grey columns. At such ranges, he noted, it was impossible to miss. The British riflemen fired with such speed and rhythmic precision that the German advance was shattered. German intelligence reports and post-battle accounts famously overestimated British machine gun strength, with commanders believing that each British battalion was equipped with 28 machine guns. In reality, each battalion possessed only 2. The devastating volume of fire that decimated the German ranks came from the rifles of individual infantry, while the specific claim that German soldiers believed they were facing machine guns lacks definitive primary source verification from the German side. The fact remains that the tactical effect of British rifle fire at Mons was indistinguishable from that of automatic weapons. By the time the No. 4 rifle reached the front lines of World War II, the landscape of war had changed, but the rifle's effectiveness had not diminished. From the scorching sands of North Africa to the dense, humidity-choked jungles of Burma, the Lee-Enfield proved to be rugged, reliable, and lethal. It was in Burma, in May 1945, that the weapon's legendary reliability and the determination of its operators were displayed in their most extreme form. Rifleman Lacheman Gurung of the 8th Gurkha Rifles found himself in a forward position under heavy Japanese attack. After a grenade exploded in his trench, destroying his right hand and blinding him in his right eye, Gurung refused to yield. For 4 hours, he held his position alone. Unable to use his right hand, he operated the bolt of his Lee-Enfield with his left hand, loading and firing one-handed while shouting challenges to the enemy, daring them to come and fight a good. When relief finally arrived the following morning, 31 Japanese soldiers lay dead directly in front of his trench. Gurung survived and was awarded the Victoria Cross. His defense was a testament to courage, but it also spoke volumes about a rifle that could be operated effectively by a severely wounded man in the worst possible conditions. The Lee-Enfield also excelled in the precise, methodical world of sniping. The number for Mark 1T was the dedicated sniper variant, produced by taking standard production rifles that had demonstrated exceptional accuracy during factory testing, specifically those capable of placing 7 consecutive shots within a 5-inch circle at 200 yards, fitting them with a No. 32 telescopic sight and a wooden cheek riser. Approximately 24,400 of these rifles were produced during the war, and they earned a reputation as one of the finest sniper systems of the conflict. While the German Kar-98K was perhaps inherently more accurate in a bench rest environment due to its rigid front-locking action, the British system proved to be a superior combat tool. The sniper variant was so successful that it remained in British service for decades after the war, eventually being converted to fire the 7.62mm NATO cartridge as the L42A1, which saw service until 1992. Comparisons between the Lee-Enfield and its contemporaries often rely on simplified categories, but one respected assessment summarizes the situation well. The Germans built the best target rifle, the Americans built the best hunting rifle, but the British built the best battle rifle. The inevitable question, however, remains: why did Britain not adopt the M1? The British Army did evaluate the American semi-automatic rifle in 1939 and again in 1943. In both instances, they declined to adopt it for standard issue. The reasons were pragmatic. The logistical nightmare of introducing a new caliber and a new parts ecosystem in the middle of a war was difficult to justify, especially when British infantry doctrine differed significantly from American doctrine. The British infantry section was built around the Bren light machine gun as the primary source of killing power. The riflemen were there to support the Bren, protect its flanks, and provide covering fire. Since both the Lee-Enfield and the Bren fired the same .303 ammunition, the logistical tale was simplified. While the Garand was easier to train recruits, Anna, 1952, study confirmed that while an expert could match a Garand with a Lee-Enfield, a novice was far more effective with the semi-automatic. Britain compensated for this gap through intensive training rather than technology. Interestingly, the Germans themselves recognized the quality of the British rifle, even if they could not fully utilize it. Following the evacuation at Dunkirk, the Wehrmacht captured a massive stockpile of British equipment, including approximately 44,000 to 48,000 Lee-Enfield rifles. Rather than scrapping these obsolete weapons, the Germans formally catalogued them as the Guha 281E. While the complications of supplying .303 ammunition prevented their widespread issue to frontline combat units, they were distributed to the Volkssturm militia, railway guards, prisoner of war camp personnel, and occupation forces throughout Europe. that the Germans, who prided themselves on their own engineering, considered the captured Lee-Enfields valuable enough to maintain and issue as a silent endorsement of the weapon's quality. The ultimate validation of the Lee-Enfield's design is found in its extraordinary longevity. The number 4 and its variants remained the standard service rifle of the British military until 1957, when it was finally replaced by the L1A1 self-loading rifle. Even then, the story was not over. The Canadian Rangers, tasked with patrolling the harsh environments of the Arctic, continued to use the Lee-Enfield for until 2018, valuing its ruggedness and reliability in freezing temperatures where modern automatics might fail. In India and Pakistan, police and paramilitary units continue to use variants of the rifle to this day, with a total production run exceeding 17 million units across all marks and nations. The Lee-Enfield stands as one of the most manufactured and widely used firearms in human history. In retrospect, the critics who labeled the Lee-Enfield as obsolete in 1939 were technically correct about the trajectory of firearms technology. The future did indeed belong to the semi-automatic and eventually the assault rifle. However, they made a critical error in their assessment of the present. They underestimated the synergy between a specific weapon design and the soldiers trained to use it. They failed to account for the rear locking bolt that allowed for lightning-fast cycling, the 10-round magazine that provided fire superiority, and the rigorous doctrine that turned riflemen into engines of suppression. The Lee-Enfield succeeded not because it was the most advanced technology on the battlefield, but because it was the right tool for the specific philosophy of the British soldier. From the desperation of Dunkirk to the victory in Europe, the obsolete bolt-action rifle held its ground against the future, proving that in war, effectiveness is the only metric that truly matters.